Welcome back to Teach English Now. In this module, we went back to 1880 and visited a teacher from the grammar translation approach. This teacher told us his purpose in teaching language was to teach young men of affluence and power to be moral by examining the literature of the Roman and Greek civilizations. Only by learning the cultural values of these civilizations through translation could his students develop into the men they were meant to be. To him, it was the intellectual exercise of translation and understanding the deep ideas expressed by these ancient writers that made language learning worthwhile. This teacher taught using classic works in the original Greek and Latin. Books such as Homer's Odyssey and the Bible provided ample material for translation, and students spent their time translating and examining long passages from these works, as well as passages from plays, poetry, short stories, and novels. This teacher made use of the technique of translation and back translation, or having the students translate from the original language into their native language, and then back into the original language. This technique required students to understand the vocabulary and the grammar of the original language and the nuances of meaning the original writer was trying to convey. The teacher used reading comprehension questions to test students' knowledge of the works they were translating and had students focus on memorizing long lists of vocabulary words. To test their knowledge of the language, he would have his students write essays in the target languages on a variety of moral topics. Let's contrast the grammar translation approach with the next approach we visited, the direct approach. This teacher was a world traveler, someone who understood that languages were a way to get to know living people, and that only learning about ancient civilizations was not a way to really get to know the world we live in. Our caricature mentioned living among the Uhutu and learning their culture, history, and people by interacting with them. His purpose was to teach his students to experience life in another culture and to learn language via experience and not just sitting in a classroom. His students were people who wanted to travel the world like he did and experience things for themselves. Our world traveler spoke about learning geography by studying maps in the target language and history by hearing his Uhutu teacher tell stories about their people. He learned languages through dialogues and conversations with native speakers and by reading passages about the people he was visiting. He was completely immersed in the target language and culture. His techniques mimicked those we might see parents use in teaching their children to speak their first language. He taught through conversations, drawing maps, question and answer sessions, and reading aloud to students. He expected his students to learn vocabulary and grammar inductively, through experiencing them, rather than by teaching them explicitly, and he encouraged his students to find and correct their own mistakes whenever possible. While each of these approaches may have had their place in language teaching history, they are very different ways of thinking about language. Grammar translation essentially ignored any aspect of speaking the language, while explicitly teaching grammar and vocabulary. On the other hand, the direct approach focused almost solely on speaking the language and learning through experience instead of explicit instruction. In the assignment at the end of the module, we'd like you to take a moment and consider each of these two approaches and how you feel about the views they take on language learning and teaching. Then, we'd like to know if you agree or disagree with these principles and why. Finally, we'd like to know if you plan to apply any of these principles in your own classroom and which techniques you might use, if any. Once you submit your response, Your classmates will have the opportunity to review your responses and provide feedback, making this a truly collaborative experience. We hope you've enjoyed what you've seen so far. In our next module, we'll visit 2 more approaches, the reading approach and the audiolingual approach. See you next time!